Good morning, friends. Yesterday I published a video about Connor Murphy and I got a lot of interesting comments and questions in the comment section. I thought today that I could make a video sort of addressing some of the most important, or at what I thought were some of the most interesting or important concerns in the comment section. Obviously some are comments that I'd have to make a whole video about, but in this video we're just going to talk about some of the minor comments that I think could clarify things for some of the listeners. So to begin, one comment that I got often in the comment section was the idea of the ego death from psychedelics being fleeting. So some people described having experienced it before, but it going away. I just wanted people to know that although maybe not everybody will experience ego death from psychedelics, and it certainly depends on your approach to them and your intention before you use them, but in general, if you've experienced it and it's been fleeting, probably if you kept doing it, it would stay. I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, but that's the case for me and many of the other people I knew. We initially got that kind of fleeting wisdom that would go away, but if with habitual and chronic use, eventually that stays. And it can stay for years and years. In my case, it stayed for years. It's still in me, even though I have, worked against it and rehabilitated myself a little bit. So that's certainly something that can get worse with duration and dose. The next question I got was whether psilocybin and LSD can be used safely at lower doses. So I want to talk about two things, two dosing schedules, and we'll use golden teacher mushrooms as a ballpark milligram dose for these two things. So microdosing, something between 100 to 300 milligrams of golden teacher mushroom. Using golden teacher mushrooms, 100 to 300 milligrams in the morning will help someone concentrate for 4 or 5 hours afterwards. What I believe is happening is that the agonism, the target of LSD and psilocybin are serotonin receptors, the 5-HT2 series receptors. I believe agonism there causes consequent dopamine transmission. At a low dose, 100 to 300 milligrams, you get a dopamine transmission that helps you concentrate. There's a second benefit of it, which is that agonism at exactly those receptors increases neurogenesis. That's exactly how SSRIs increase neurogenesis. So if you keep taking mushrooms or LSD at a low dose, you will increase neurogenesis and you will increase dopamine. I believe that doing this for a long period could potentially put you in danger if you're susceptible to it. I believe what's much safer is using a slightly higher dose rarely. So what I'm talking about is not the hero's dose of golden teacher mushrooms, which most people use 4 to 5 grams, but rather something between 500 milligrams to 800 milligrams. I believe this could be interesting. It's fun. It's like going with some people to the pub and having a couple of beers. You feel the serotonin signaling, you get a bit of dopamine transmission, you get a little bit of visual effects, but it's not too intense. If you do this rarely, I believe this would probably be the safest approach. I don't think it's ever safe to do a hero's dose. Almost everybody, you can't really be sure. So a hero's dose could destroy you. I highly doubt that a 500 to 800 milligram single dose could. So that's just a personal opinion. Be careful. Something else I got asked about a lot was whether SSRIs can cause the same problems. A couple of people mentioned that when they began their SSRI medications, they ended up manic. Now I want to tell you guys that the reason that happened to you is not your fault. It's your psychiatrist's fault. There was no reason for that to happen to you except that they dosed you wrong and gave you the wrong expectations. So SSRIs inhibit the reuptake of serotonin. That means they let serotonin signal at the target of LSD and psilocybin more. So if you, for example, are not taking SSRIs and suddenly you take a huge dose, acutely for a week, you will feel the feelings of having high serotonin levels. You're not supposed to feel that. Why? The goal of giving you an SSRI is to long-term increase neurogenesis and reduce inflammation in the brain. But that doesn't happen within the first week anyway. It takes months and months for that to happen. And it only happens with long-term signaling. So the goal is mainly to prevent the patient from experiencing side effects in the beginning. How do you do that? By microdosing them. So for example, my drug, fluvoxamine, often psychiatrists will give you 100 milligrams to start at night, which is really their planned maximum to go to 150 milligrams at the max dose. So basically they gave you the whole dose in the beginning. Before your serotonin autoreceptor, the 5-HT1A, downregulated the serotonin receptors, you feel everything intensely. That's a recipe for side effects. The correct approach is to use something like 25 milligrams. By the way, no psychiatrist ever taught me this. I taught myself this through experience. If you start with 25 milligrams at night for a couple of weeks, the patient won't notice anything. And you can slowly increase it only as the patient adapts. So there's literally no side effects. If the patient feels any effect, the dose should never be raised. In fact, maybe it should be lessened until they feel no effect. Then you could raise it again. So this is not your fault, guys. And unfortunately, I believe this often turns people away from SSRIs. This, coupled with the fact that many psychiatrists don't tell their patients, don't expect anything for 6 months. And if you do that, then you'll notice some big changes 6 to 7 months down the line. Another question I got was whether Ibogaine can cause bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Now, there are no case reports of this ever happening. There isn't much academic evidence for it. I'm going to tell you what my personal impressions are, having used Ibogaine extensively in my life also. Ibogaine is not a really pleasant experience. It's not, also, the actual experience subjectively is not that clear. And it's not pleasant. So people will not tend to do flood doses of Ibogaine repetitively unless they're needing to get off another drug. They're using it as something to help them get away from addiction. It's very rare that somebody's going to be doing flood doses frequently, first of all. Second of all, Ibogaine inhibits dopamine transmission after a flood dose very potently. Like, it'll be hard for you to feel euphoric. It'll be hard for you to smoke a cigarette, actually. It'll be hard for you to do anything dopaminergic after you use Ibogaine. So Ibogaine actually inhibits dopaminergic signaling, which is what somebody would want to do if they were trying to inhibit mania, bipolar disorder, or if they were schizophrenic. They would want to inhibit dopamine signaling. But would you want to use Ibogaine for that, by the way? No, because Ibogaine increases neurogenesis a lot. And in schizophrenics and people with bipolar disorder or with mania, if you increase neurogenesis more, you allow the brain to change more. It could get way worse. You actually want to reduce neurogenesis, which is why dopamine receptor antagonists and antipsychotics, which block excitatory activity overall and actually decrease neurogenesis overall, those are what are used to treat people with this condition. So to answer your question, I don't think that Ibogaine could necessarily cause this. However, if someone was in this state, Ibogaine I don't think would be a great option because it would increase your neurogenesis a lot, despite it reducing dopaminergic signaling. Now, I also got asked about my opinion on Kratom specifically. Does Kratom have a likelihood to cause this in people? Well, first of all, there's no case reports of Kratom causing schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Second of all, I'll tell you guys about my personal experience knowing a lot of heroin addicts, meeting a lot of people in Los Angeles that were addicted to heroin and meth, and a lot of people addicted just to meth. What I noticed is this. First of all, I have never met a heroin addict that had schizophrenia. I haven't. I'm sure there are that just have schizophrenia and happen to then use heroin, but I'm pretty sure there aren't people that develop schizophrenia from using heroin. Sure, when you go through a heroin withdrawal, you'll be a little manic, but there's something about mu opioid receptor signaling, I feel, that inhibits some anxiogenic effects of other drugs and can sort of protect your brain from going haywire in that dopaminergic fashion or in some other direction. Interestingly though, the kappa opioid receptor does produce some psychedelic effects. In fact, salvia uses the kappa opioid receptor, but the mu opioid receptor seems to overpower that effect. So for Kratom, because Kratom is such a potent agonist of the mu opioid receptor, despite the fact that it increases adrenaline and could make some people anxious, if it wasn't for that mu opioid receptor agonism, I think the mu opioid receptor agonism will probably protect people from developing any kind of psychological disorders from Kratom use. In fact, what I've noticed in Skid Row, to be honest with you, is that people who use both heroin and meth, even though they use meth, when they use heroin, those people tend not to be the people who hear voices. So it seems really protective. I'm not, of course, encouraging anyone to use it. Personally, I have always been extremely concerned about using opioid receptor agonists because we need our opioid receptors in case something goes wrong with us. If you ever do get hurt, it's very clear in the literature that using an opioid receptor agonist will downregulate people's opioid receptors. In fact, using naltrexone, which blocks opioid receptors, upregulates them in the long term. So people who use opioid drugs tend to have a lower threshold for pain because they've downregulated their opioid receptors. So this is something really you should be careful about. And this is one of the main reasons I caution people away from Kratom. Very dangerous drug. You need your opioid receptors for when something really goes wrong with you. Another question is this. Is schizophrenia something to be that concerned about? Is it that bad to just hear voices or see things? The weird thing is, when I was younger, I wasn't that scared of it. I thought that you just hear random voices, that the voices wouldn't be particularly biased against you. I discovered something quite different later on. So just for you guys to know, I actually have a half-aunt who was schizophrenic, who committed suicide. So I've been around her since I was very young, seen schizophrenics, and I also knew now, since I've been in LA, probably hundreds of schizophrenics. What was surprised me most about them is I've only met one schizophrenic who all his voices that he heard were positive. They had a positive affect. Every other person I met either had a mixture of positive and negative voices, which was rare, or the majority, vast majority, and this is in the academic literature, the vast majority of schizophrenics have negative, self-critical voices that cause them anxiety. Imagine living with somebody in your head that is speaking, that you hear as if he's next to you, that is constantly telling you negative crap all day. It is horrific. And that's why schizophrenics suffer so much. Every schizophrenic I've known personally was in extreme emotional pain all the time. And that's why they die very young also, just from that level of anxiety and pain constantly. So schizophrenia isn't just hearing a voice that, who cares? It's hearing a voice that is telling you very negative stuff all day for the rest of your life. That's the really big concern. And of course, you can sometimes limit the amount that people hear voices with dopamine antagonists, but usually it's not that common that people can totally inhibit the voices. Even with dopamine antagonists, very strong ones, injectables and orals and everything else. So it's a really difficult condition to have. Now, what does schizophrenia feel like when it starts happening? This is what I want you guys to watch out for. Now, some people will have visual hallucinations when they get schizophrenia, but most people have just auditory hallucinations. How it usually starts, and this is in the academic literature, and I've heard this from many people. Usually, you'll hear something with white noise, like it could be a sound outside your house, or it could be an AC or something, some background noise. When you're not paying attention to it, will start to sound like either someone's voice or a music or something. But when you pay attention to it, you'll notice, oh no, that's just the AC. That's how it starts. And then eventually you get to a point where when you pay attention to it, you still hear that voice or song or something like that. This is the beginnings of it. If you ever notice this, head to a psychiatrist as soon as you can and try to tell the psychiatrist that you're hearing some odd things and you want to be potentially on a short-term dopamine receptor antagonist to stop this from happening. Usually, if people don't stop this from happening, that's often how they start to hear voices on their own. Now it's not white noise anymore, it's just a voice. And once that happens, you can't really get rid of it. But you can often when it's just a white noise kind. Is bipolar similarly horrific? I believe potentially it's slightly less horrific, but bipolar disorder is also extremely concerning. What happens in bipolar disorder is people basically become irrational. What does irrationality mean in economics? Irrationality is a lack of consistency. So what happens in bipolar disorder is people's moods. A lot of people, by the way, are cyclothemic. Most great people in the world, very high functioning people, are cyclothemic. They don't stay at a same level of energy all year round. In bipolar disorder, these moods will become so pathologic that they harm your life. So for example, I have a family member who has full-fledged bipolar disorder, and she cannot sit with somebody for more than 30 minutes without flipping on them. She may be very excited and happy to talk to you for a while, but her negative mood will come and she'll turn against you in the same meeting, and she can't control herself. So she begins to hurt her family members and people around her. This very often happens with people with bipolar disorder. How does bipolar disorder start? Well, it usually starts with a period of mania. And what mania means is that you're overly optimistic, you might have euphoria, you're very upbeat, ambitious, driven, motivated, and likely have difficulty sleeping and turning off that drive throughout the day. Somebody mentioned in the comment section that they get this way when they quit marijuana. Habitual marijuana smokers will feel this once they quit for a couple of days. Usually it won't go so bad for them, but they'll feel that. That is the mania. That's how it feels like also when you're using dopaminergic drugs or when you're using psychedelics. The same kind of thing happens in the beginning, so that's something to watch out for. Another question is, can you tell from someone's genetic analysis whether they're predisposed towards schizophrenia and bipolar disorder? And also, a lot of people were saying that, hey, if you have relatives with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, then don't do psychedelics. That is not a good way to go about it. Let me give an example. My aunt, right, schizophrenic, and she committed suicide. My mother, bipolar disorder. I have a lot of other mental illness in my family. I've never went schizophrenic. I've never went bipolar. And my genes, my SNPs, I have a lot of SNPs associated with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. But it's never happened to me. I have a resilient brain, right? Whereas my friend, the Canadian guy we were talking about, zero relatives that have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Zero. There's no mental illness in his family. So you can't really easily predict by your family members. Not only that, I'll tell you guys something interesting. As you know, I used to do genetic analysis for people. Right now, I'm trying to work on automatizing the program so that I don't have to do it by hand, so it can be cheaper for you guys. And that's why I've been doing it for a while. But I used to have a section on cognition in which I cover basically every single nucleotide polymorphism in someone's genes that are associated with something relevant to cognition. Every single person who I've looked through their genes has had some SNP associated with either bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. So I highly doubt that anyone watching this does not have some gene associated with it. I highly doubt it. So basically, can you really predict from your family? Not so much. I would rather rely on yourself. If you feel neurotic, if you're a guy on edge, if you're a person with OCD, If you're that kind of way, that's what I would rely on personally to scare me off. Another thing that I thought about when I was going through the comment section was that while these drugs, LSD and psilocybin, as well as dopaminergic drugs, could make you schizophrenic or develop bipolar disorder, it's interesting that a couple of other drugs seem to be able to change people's sexual preferences. I've noticed this for years in Los Angeles. I mean, for example, living in downtown LA, I used to come across a lot of ex-gangsters from East LA, from Compton and South Central, and from Watts, that would move to Skid Row after they became methamphetamine addicts. You see, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of ex-gangsters in Los Angeles would become crack addicts when they're older. And they, so this was quite common. But the crack addicts didn't often have this well, they often had hypersexuality, but people weren't noticing people turning gay as much when they were using crack. Interestingly, I've noticed this a lot. These ex-gangsters that started using meth, living in downtown LA, a lot of them are hypersexual and gay, or bisexual, usually bisexual. And they weren't bisexual before they started using meth. So it's a really fascinating subject. Actually, I met a lady once from Maryland in Los Angeles who told me a joke. She said, what's the difference between a gay guy and a straight guy? In Maryland, we say it's a $20 bag of meth. So it's a really fascinating subject. Both methamphetamine, any dopaminergic drug really, and GHB, for example, really increase allopregnanolone levels. The dopamine also, in general, when you increase dopamine, it immediately, that's the actual way mechanically that pharmacologically people reduce prolactin. So when you increase dopamine, you have hypersexuality due to reduced prolactin, and you have enhanced allopregnanolone synthesis. For some reason, and particularly with meth, this seems to sometimes turn people bisexual or gay. Anyway, I wanted to know if any of you guys have noticed this as well, and what your thoughts on it might be. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next time.